October the 7th, 1981, Red Square, Moscow. The Soviet Union at the height of its power. 64 years after the great socialist October Revolution, Moscow has become the center of world communism and the second superpower next to the United States. In 1991, tanks are once again rolling through the streets of Moscow, but this time they're aimed at the Russian parliament. The old-style communist faction of the party wants to put an end to Gorbachev's reform policies. But the people of Moscow fight back. Boris Yeltsin, the first president of the Russian Federation to have been elected in free elections, is standing on an armored tank appealing to the people that they resist the tanks of the putschists. The putsch fails. And with it, the greatest political and social experiment of the 20th century. Yeltsin offers hope for a new post-Gorbachev policy after the demise of the empire. Does the end of the Soviet Union also mean the end of the communist idea? An idea that has captured the imagination of people all over the world for decades. How can one explain the collapse of the communist system, the fall from world power to political nothingness?
The system was incapable of reforming itself. That is the heart of the matter. The reason lies in Gorbachev's precipitous experiments. I have no doubt about that.
I think the notion of creating a perfect society by going counter to human nature is dead. Because the basic error of communism was that it simply did not understand human nature.
The Soviet system failed because of its absurd notion of mankind, which could not meet the challenges of modernization through industry and information technology. Even the bureaucrats no longer believed in the system. The party people became increasingly cynical and corrupt, and acted merely by rote and without moral vigor.
President Reagan was in the right time, in the right place, and he found dead bear, and he told, I killed them.
Some people came to power who never should have, who had nothing to do with fulfilling the communist idea.
Communism as an ideology was emancipatory, and as a system of government, oppressive.
The myth of the October Revolution. The storming of the Winter Palace, seat of government, on October the 25th, 1917, according to the Russian Gregorian calendar. Legend and reality. The famous film director, Sergei Eisenstein, staged the dramatic events with powerful images. In his film, October, the revolutionary masses, led by Lenin, stormed the palace. Their goal, to depose the corrupt government. But in reality, Lenin wasn't there. The famous film was propaganda. The truth looked entirely different.
Suddenly the Bolsheviks, after a rebellion that most of the population hadn't noticed, that was the night when bridges and banks and everything else were taken over. And on the next morning, the Bolsheviks were in power.
On the morning after the coup, the palace was besieged by curious bystanders. There was little damage, just a few broken windows.
No art objects at the Winter Palace were destroyed. Everything in the wine cellar was destroyed, so that the Red Guard could... They drank all these wines. 200 or 100 years old. Cognacs and everything was broken. What a shame.
This was done by several hundred members of the Red Guard and sailors under the command of Leon Trotsky. First evidence of his talents as a strategist.
Trotsky, der Urheber des Stadtstreiches.
Trotsky, who initiated the coup, once said that a disciplined and loyal regiment would have been sufficient to thwart the coup, but there was no such regiment.
The big winner of the Bolshevist October Revolution is Lenin. His uncompromising will to power helped him prevail within his own party and then in Russia as a whole. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was born in 1870 in rural Simbirsk, the son of a school inspector. His mother, a nobleman's daughter, is an enlightened Democrat, and she passes these ideals on to her children. Vladimir displays talent and extraordinary intelligence as a pupil. When his brother Alexander is executed in 1887 for participating in a failed assassination attempt on the Tsar, Vladimir too chooses a revolutionary path. A few years later, he assumes the nom de guerre, Lenin.
If you look at our leaders, from Lenin to Putin, they all came from the working class, peasants, or from workers with a higher education. All except Lenin himself, and that is crucial. Lenin hailed from nobility, and is thus entwined with both the old and the new. Lenin's attitude towards Russian autocracy hardly differed from that of the radical faction of the so-called Russian revolutionary intelligentsia. For them, the Tsarist regime was the embodiment of evil.
Für die revolutionäre Intelligenzia verkörperte das zarische Regime das Böse.
Tsar Nicholas II rules a country stretching from Warsaw to Vladivostok, an autocratic monarch who answers only to God and himself, his allies the nobility, who have divided the country up amongst themselves, a small but immensely wealthy upper class. Russia is an agrarian society. 80% of its 135 million inhabitants work in agriculture. Serfdom of peasants is abolished in 1861, making them free citizens, but they still don't own the land. Compared with peasants, there are only a few industrial workers, 3 million. Many peasants flee from rural poverty to the big cities. In the few factories in St. Petersburg, Moscow and Minsk, they toil for starvation wages, often 18 hours a day. The people live under the most inhumane conditions, deracinated, thrown together in mass housing. The Tsarist regime resists any attempts to democratize it. Political parties were outlawed until 1905, and their members persecuted, arrested and imprisoned. Thousands were incarcerated or banished.
The more backward a country is, the greater the likelihood of violent protest actions, and the stronger the pressure exerted by the state, the police and the military in a society, the less likely that the goals of the socialist movements could be achieved through democratic means.
It was a vision of forging a civitas without exploiters. A totally egalitarian society where only workers exist. And the exploiters are degraded to second-class citizens.
Zu Menschen zweiten Grades degradiert werden.
The more pragmatic Western society transform Marxism into social democracy inside that. The Russian mentality want to implement all these things just like you read it in the book.
In November 1895, Lenin founds the Revolutionary League for the Liberation of the Working Class. Accused of political agitation, he's banished to Siberia in 1897. Here he marries the revolutionary Nadezhda Krupskaya. After his banishment, Lenin leaves Russia to go into exile. A brilliant theorist and born orator, Lenin becomes leader of the radical wing of the Russian Social Democrats. Because his wing manages to win a party assembly vote by a slim majority, he gives his faction the name Bolsheviki, which means majority holders. The democratic parliamentarian-oriented wing, which is actually larger, gets the name Mensheviki, or minority holders. The Bolsheviki uncompromisingly advocate the dictatorship of the proletariat.
The assumption is that mankind is good. Thus, as opposed to conservative or liberal beliefs, mankind doesn't need any checks and balances, any control. And that is communism's basic fallacy, also with Lenin, which led to the unchecked power that was inherent in Bolshevism from the beginning.
It was supposed to be a party of professional revolutionaries, a firmly disciplined, centralized party which was to assume the role of avant-garde of the working class. This conception, which marked an incredible rupture in the history of the Marxist movement, was revolutionary.
The basic premise is people do not know what is good for them. An elite, scientific method must find out objectively what is good for the people. Subjectivity isn't relevant here.
Summer 1914. The assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne brings the international tension to breaking point. Russia mobilizes its troops. Germany declares war. While living in exile, Lenin believes that the outbreak of the First World War is a historical necessity and signals the impending end of capitalism. The hardships of war intensify the economic and political tension in Russia. The masses protest against hunger, the war, the government, and the Tsar. Nicholas II is forced to abdicate after the February Revolution. A provisional government is formed, and all over the country, worker and soldier councils, the Soviets. The irreconcilable differences between the parliamentarian bourgeois government of Kerensky and the radical Soviets hinder finding solutions to urgent problems. While war is raging in most of Europe, Lenin, exiled in Zurich, formulates his radical program. He rejects a parliamentary republic and in his famous April Theses demands the elimination of the provisional government and the assumption of power by the Soviets. The reaction of Lenin's comrades in Russia to his theses is unenthusiastic.
Man war damals der Meinung, Lenin habe aufgrund seines langjährigen Exils die russische
One thought back then that Lenin's long exile didn't allow him an accurate grasp of the Russian reality, that he'd even lost touch with it. Solidarity of all democratic revolutionary forces was the order of the day.
Revolutionären Kräfte.
You have to remember, Lenin jumped in the revolution in the middle of this. He was not the person who really started this, initiated the revolution. At that time he lived in Switzerland, drank beer and discussed the German economy.
Lenin realizes that he must return to Russia to spearhead the movement. His goals are an immediate armistice and a major land reform. He seeks the support of the masses. The German imperial government offers Lenin and other exiled revolutionaries freedom of passage. The exiles travel across Germany in a sealed train carriage. Lenin's return to St. Petersburg is supposed to destabilize Germany's war enemy, Russia. Revolution in Russia, an opportunity for the German Supreme Military Command to successfully end the war on the Eastern Front.
Lenin's griffige Parole.
Lenin's catchy slogan, "End the imperialistic war now," and his other slogan, "Rob what was robbed from you." He incited the peasants to confiscate the property of the landowners. These slogans had an enormous effect on Russian peasantry and on the Russian lower class. And Lenin adapted himself to the mood of the Russian underclasses.
Lenin is greeted enthusiastically by his followers when he arrives on April the 16th, 1917. The next day, he gives his programmatic speech before a Bolshevist party assembly. The bourgeois February Revolution must be followed by the socialist revolution in Russia. He enforces this decision, an armed rebellion with the objective of seizing power. In May 1917, Leon Trotsky returns to Russia. He too had been active in the working class movement in the late 19th century, was banished to Siberia because of his underground activities, and lived in exile for many years after fleeing. He and Lenin demanded the overthrow of the provisional government, as well as world revolution. Trotsky organizes the storming of the Winter Palace, has the provisional government arrested, and helps Lenin and the Bolsheviks gain power.
They had gained power in one of the most backward countries in the world, 140 million inhabitants, an agrarian society, very few industrial workers, an 80% illiteracy rate. The whole country was in ruins, destroyed by 3 years of World War I. And now the revolutionaries were faced with the contradiction of wanting to build a new socialist society, the contradiction between striving for an ideal and reality.
Immediately after the victory of the revolution, the new government, the Council of People's Commissars, put Lenin's plans into practice. First of all, Lenin offered the Germans an immediate armistice. In the spirit of world revolution, German and Russian soldiers fraternize. Lenin's other plan, the land reform, is also implemented immediately. Because the peasant soldiers want to return home, the army is dissolved. The big land estates are expropriated without compensation, surveyed and given to landless peasants. The old dream of Russian peasantry comes true. Millions of peasants become landowners.
Einerseits war natürlich die marxistische
On the one hand, Marx's doctrine was very important for Lenin. And Marx's doctrine stipulates that this land shall be nationalized. On the other hand, Lenin had a keen sense of what the agrarian population wanted, unlike many dogmatic Marxists, even in the Bolshevist party. And he knew that the nationalization of land immediately, that this measure would make the peasantry so angry and reject the system. So he wanted to put this issue on hold for a bit.
Wollte ein bisschen warten.
Lenin was a smart man. He had to realize that Russia wasn't a developed industrial country like Germany or England or even Belgium or France. Russia was an agrarian country with a relatively small population of industrial workers. One couldn't build a revolution only on the workers in Moscow and Petrograd. And so that was his contribution to revolutionary theory. And his great student was maybe not Stalin, but Mao.
For the new landowners, Lenin is a hero. They believe in a better future and celebrate the socialist revolution. For the leading theorist of the German Social Democrats, Karl Kautsky, this is willfully misleading.
According to Kautsky, what Lenin and his followers were planning in Russia and carried out in 1917 was not a proletarian revolution and not the first great socialist revolution, but the last bourgeois revolution.
Marx and Engels
said in the Communist Manifesto that the Communist program can be summarized in one sentence: the abolition of private property.
Die Abschaffung des Privateigentums.
According to Karl Marx, the private ownership of the means of production is to be nationalized. The bourgeois society can only be overcome through the dictatorship of the proletariat. In the eyes of radical socialists, Lenin is not a Marxist.
More than 90% of the arable land in Russia was in the hands of peasants at the time of the Civil War. So one could say that he was a dogmatic Marxist, but a flexible one.
Even more radically, one could ask, was Marx a Marxist? Isaac Berlin once wrote, if Marx rose from the grave, he'd say, and above all, I am not a Marxist. For Lenin, it wasn't just a tough ideological struggle, it was also linked to his utter disdain for the people who believed in those ideas. Although Lenin almost never used harsh words against his opponents. No, he was calm and matter-of-fact. His entire hatred and disdain was directed against liberals and social democrats, although they should be much closer to him than his true opponents.
On November the 25th, 1917, there are the first free elections in Russia. For the first time in history, women have equal suffrage. The winner is the party of the social revolutionaries. The Bolsheviks receive only 1/4 of the votes. Lenin feels that his power is jeopardized and in December founds the National Secret Police, the Cheka.
The Bolsheviks, like all left-of-center parties, fought under the Tsarist regime for a constitutional assembly resulting from free elections with secret ballots. Finally, in November 1917, such elections did take place, and in early January 1918, the Constitutional Assembly met. And then it became clear that 70% of its members were a peasant party.
When the delegates of the Constitutional Assembly vote in their first meeting on January the 18th, 1918, against all power being transferred to the Soviets, Lenin leaves the room. It was the last meeting the Bolsheviks allowed.
And then, on Lenin's orders, the meeting was disrupted and dissolved.
The next day, Lenin has the gates locked and the delegates arrested. This marks the end of democracy in Russia after just one day.
After the
violent dissolution of the Constitutional Assembly, the Bolsheviks refuted the democratic principle of adapting to the will of the majority. And this means that they could govern this majority, who rejected them, only with force and dictatorial means.
At Lubyanka Square in Moscow's center, the Cheka sets up shop. The first chief of secret police of the Soviet regime is Felix Dzerzhinsky, a confidant of Lenin. Under Dzerzhinsky's direction, the Cheka becomes the most important instrument for maintaining power.
The Cheka, the secret police, fought not only opponents of the revolution, but mostly Mensheviks and social revolutionaries. Those supporters of the revolution who weren't Bolsheviks.
Lenin was not in favor of ruining rule of law. He said, socialist democracy is bourgeois democracy without the bourgeoisie. Socialist culture is the continuation of bourgeois culture without the bourgeoisie, etc., etc. The socialist state is the continuation of the bourgeois state without the bourgeoisie, without exploitation, etc., etc.
Lenin and
Dzerzhinsky had a huge state apparatus at their disposal to fight what they called the irrationality of the masses.
The prisons from Tsarist times were not enough to hold all the prisoners captured by the Cheka. Only 3 months after the October Revolution, dissidents are sent to forced labor camps, making relatives as well as perpetrators culpable. Isolation confinement, torture and murder are the means used by the secret police to, as Dzerzhinsky says, save the revolution.
This is
an attempt to adapt reality to the utopia, a utopia which is removed from reality, and this reality rebels. So one attempts to adapt this reality by force. That's why I would say that this attempt inevitably led to terror, because it's impossible to create a social paradise on Earth.
If you want to create paradise on Earth, doesn't that justify it? A little terror here and there, if the end result is paradise.
The Bolsheviks proudly call their bloody procedure Red Terror. In the famous decree on the Red Terror, it says, in the current situation, it is necessary to secure the heartland through terror. To protect the Soviet Republic from class enemies, they will be isolated in concentration camps. Persons involved in White Guard organizations, conspiracies and revolts will be shot.
Glorifying this red terror and needing to rationalize it, I think these are on the one hand remnants of the thinking during World War I, and on the other they stem from the idea that only by force can we implement a better way. The term socialist terror is a contradiction in itself. It paved the way for many things that were later put into practice under Stalin. The end justifies the means, doesn't it? And as one can see with Lenin's pronounced advocacy of terror, it didn't only start with Stalin.
The Bolshevik government is threatened from both within and from abroad. The armistice with Germany mobilizes the other war opponents. Britain, France and America send troops to Russia. In southern Russia, the Cossacks revolt. They allied themselves with the other formerly Tsarist troop contingents to form the so-called White Armies.
Die weißen Armeen verkörperten
For the majority of the Russian population, the peasants and the workers who rejected Bolshevism, the White Armies represented the old regime. The same old regime that would reinstate the class system that the Bolsheviks had abolished in October 1917.
Lenin commissions Trotsky to establish a Red Army of workers and peasants. Bloody conflict rages all over the country. Villages are burned to the ground, people are killed, and the government secures its own power through terror. Prisoners are shot. Lenin calls for the Red Army to resist.
Капиталисты Англии, Америки, Франции ведут войну против России. Они помогают деньгами и военными припасами русским помещикам.
In the summer of 1918, the Red Army is in retreat and the revolution is in jeopardy. Lenin hopes for support from Germany.
And then this massive goal they set for themselves. We're on the eve of world revolution. It's unfortunate that we're doing this now in Moscow, but there's no doubt, says Trotsky, that in a few weeks we'll be holding our Comintern conferences in Berlin, Paris and London. What optimism!
Einen unglaublichen Optimismus.
And auch hier And here, too, in the United States, there were big industrial strikes and riots, adjustment problems, economic and social adjustment after the war.
Probleme von Anpassung, so wirtschaftlich und sozialer.
And our elites back then were very, very afraid that such revolutionary currents could reach us as well.
Angst, dass es wird bei uns so eine Art revolutionäre Strömungen kommen.
Die Bolschewiki haben
The Bolsheviks gained power in Russia for the purpose of igniting a world revolution.
Die Weltrevolution auszulösen.
So they thought that the World War, which had shattered the existing capitalist order, was a unique opportunity for the proletarian parties to abolish the capitalist order once and for all.
Für die proletarischen Parteien sei.
The actual victory of the proletarian revolution was to be in the West, according to Lenin.
Sollte für Lenin natürlich im hochindustrialisierten Westen stattfinden.
After the lost war, revolution comes to Germany. The SPD splinters into the Independent and Majority Social Democrats, the USPD, and the revolutionary Spartacist League, which models itself on the Russian Revolution. In this recording, SPD delegate and President of Parliament Philipp Scheidemann reports on this day.
Already on the morning of November 9th, 1918, the Reichstag looked like an army camp. Workers and soldiers went in and out, many carried weapons. Ebert and I sat with some other friends hungrily in the dining hall. As usual, just thin water-like soup was served. Then a group of workers and soldiers stormed the hall and went directly to our table. 50 people screamed at once. Scheidemann, come with us. Philip, you must come out and speak. Liebknecht wants to declare a Soviet republic. What? The situation became clear to me. Germany as a Russian province, a Soviet branch. No, 1,000 times no. I saw the Russian madness before me, the Tsarist reign of terror replaced by a Bolshevist one. No, no, not that in Germany, on top of all the other suffering.
To preempt Karl Liebknecht, Philipp Scheidemann declares Germany to be a democratic republic.
Nothing must happen that dishonors the workers' movement. Be unified and faithful and honor your duties. The old and rotten monarchy has collapsed. Long live the new. Long live the German Republic.
Among Marx and Engels' political heirs, a fraternal struggle ensues. While Scheidemann's majority Social Democrats choose the path to parliamentary democracy, the radical left fights for the Soviet or Workers' Council system. All power to the Workers' Councils was the slogan of the Spartacus League, founded in 1916 by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg.
Ich glaube, dass die Rosa Luxemburg
I believe that Rosa Luxemburg was such a, I'll say, fundamentalist Democrat, that she had to reject anything that would impair democratic development, because it would lead to despotism.
ablehnen musste, weil sie sagt, das führt zu einer Willkürherrschaft.
Rosa Luxemburg was, I believe, the only revolutionary figure in Europe who could rival Lenin.
Lenin hätte trotzen können.
And he might have even accepted it.
Born and raised in Poland, Rosa Luxemburg has been living in Berlin since 1899 and become the leading politician of the German left. In 1918, she co-founded the Communist Party. She increasingly criticizes the militant left and also the great leaders of the Russian Revolution.
Sie hatte auch beobachtet, dass Lenin selbst nicht zimperlich war mit Gegnern. Allerdings muss ich sagen,
she had also observed that Lenin pulled no punches when fighting opponents. However, I must say that despite Bolshevism's foresight, if you look at her theoretical underpinnings, and especially the famous sentence about freedom always being the freedom of those who think differently, then you notice that what she thought and wanted wasn't as liberal and pluralistic as it seemed on first appearance. In her writings, there are funny and interesting passages that say the deciding majority doesn't always have to be a quantitative one. Now savour that one. So Rosa Luxemburg did have a keen sense of power issues.
Auch Rosa Luxemburg hatte durchaus Sinn für die Machtfrage.
She saw the great danger that minority action would end in catastrophe. But on the other hand, she, who seemingly had faith in the spontaneity of the masses, was no longer able to contradict mass action once it happened. And that's how she justified the Spartacus revolt, an action she hadn't wanted.
Revolutionary sailors hoist the red flag on the Brandenburg Gate. The Spartacus League believes, like its great role model Lenin, that the time is right for revolt, and on January the 6th, 1919, declares that the provisional German government has been deposed.
A civil war, as Rosa Luxemburg imagined, should it have broken out in Germany, would not have remained restricted to Germany alone, but have mobilized the Allies. That meant prolonging the World War. And that was irresponsible in the view of the governing Social Democrats, the worst possible case imaginable.
The government's troops were supported in the fight against the rebels by the Free Corps, volunteer troops who formed after the dissolution of the Imperial Army. The revolt is suppressed with much carnage. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg are arrested and then murdered by members of the Free Corps.
If the advocates of the revolutionary class struggle hadn't splintered from the social democratic establishment, and if the social democratic establishment had adhered to the dogma of class struggle and to rigorous rejection of any cooperation with the bourgeois parties, then the parliamentary democracy, called the Weimar Republic, would never have existed.
namens Weimarer Republik gegeben. Dann wären die Sozialdemokraten...
Then the majority faction of Social Democrats would have been incapable of doing what they had to do in order to ensure democratic development in Germany, namely working together with moderate bourgeois parties. This division of the workers' movement during the First World War was both prerequisite and millstone for the Weimar Republic.
On January the 19th, 1918, the Constitutional Congress of the Weimar Republic is elected. The winners are the bourgeois parties. Germany is now a parliamentary democracy and federal republic. A revolution, according to the Russian model, has failed. In Russia, the civil war continues. But while the poorly organized White Army is losing ground, the Red Army is advancing. Leon Trotsky built an army of 5 million soldiers. In his famous armored train, he travels to precarious battlegrounds and reinforces discipline. Deserters are shot immediately. Soviet troops beat the White Armies and their foreign allies across the board. On December the 13th, 1919, the Allies decide to no longer support the White Armies. The Red Army marches to victory. The Civil War has a gruesome aftermath. Red commissars are sent out to confiscate food for the army. The peasants revolt. They no longer tend their fields. And before they let the supplies be taken away, they set their own barns on fire. Russia experiences the worst famine in its history. Over 5 million people die. Lenin and his Bolshevists have won the Civil War. The power struggle is settled, and Russia is the only country in which the communist revolution is victorious.
All other communists were in small parties. Not many. Once in a while they revolted. Between 1919 and 1924 there were about 40 revolts, all of them suppressed. And the Russian communists, they did it. That was right at the beginning. A true willingness to let the Russian communists take the lead. In July 1920, the Second Congress of the Communist International takes place in Moscow. The world revolution can only succeed, Lenin claims, if the policy and actions of all communist parties are controlled centrally from Moscow. In that respect, the Communist Party of Russia, as it now calls itself, is generous. It was an open secret that there were very few communist parties that had enough money to independently finance their activities. Everything else was done by Moscow, by the instructors who came with and distributed the money, so that it would be invested to the maximum benefit of Comintern and the Soviet government. Every functionary knew that he was getting the money from Moscow. A massive propaganda campaign hopes to win over the people for communism. Party workers were sent to the country in special trains to teach the people how to read and write. And they also advertised their idea. After oppression and exploitation in the past, the proletariat would now assume leadership. In the factories, workers would decide. The profit system would be abolished. Apartment houses, hospitals and schools would be built. From now on, everything will be done for the benefit of the people. And it will be the communists who will lead the way into this glorious future.
The education of the people was undertaken systematically and on a large scale, based on higher humanist ideals. One must take into account that the development level of our society and our state was not very high at the time, if one may say that. We were just beginning to emancipate ourselves from the darkness, lawlessness and illiteracy that was the legacy of Tsarist Russia. 76% of the population was illiterate, By the early 1940s, we'd achieved a literacy rate of almost 100%. We brought culture and knowledge to the people, raised its intellect, not just that of a few, but of the entire population. At the same time, of course, there was also an element of intimidating those who still believed in the old order and who had a different conception of state power.
Using the same method with which they won the Civil War, the Bolsheviks want to rebuild the country. This system is known as war communism and is based upon the mandatory delivery by peasants, upon nationalization and forced labor, or militarization of labor as Trotsky calls it. But there is resistance all over the country.
The war communism system, the Russian reality, was forced through boundless terror to adapt itself to doctrine. This attempt failed, not least because the majority of the population after the Civil War had been won could no longer bear the Bolshevist reign of terror.
Die bolschewistische Terrorherrschaft nicht weiter dulden konnte.
In January 1921, workers in Petrograd go on strike. The government responds with martial law and arbitrary mass arrests. On February the 28th, 1921, 16,000 sailors joined the striking workers. They appeal to the people, the time has come to sweep away the autocratic commissars. All power to the Soviets, no power for the party. The strikers demand an end to oppression, to terror and to arrests. They demand that the freedoms gained in the revolution be reinstated, together with free elections with secret ballots, freedom of speech and other parties.
The Kronstadt sailors were the most ardent advocates of the revolution, and they were always praised by the Bolshevist leadership as a bastion of the revolution. But then the sailors turned away from the autocratic leadership, which crushed the democratic impulses and structures.
Von der Zerschlagung der demokratischen Regungen, der demokratischen Strukturen im Lande abgewendet.
On Lenin's order, the Red Army advances across the Baltic Sea ice to attack on March the 7th. After 11 days and harsh struggles, the sailor insurrection is brutally crushed.
Die Niederschlagung des Aufstandes der Kronstadter Matrosen.
The crushing of the Kronstadt sailor rebellion revealed the true nature of the Bolshevist regime, because the Kronstadt sailors fought the Bolshevist dictatorship in the name of Soviet democracy.
Gegen die bolschewistische Diktatur im Namen der Sowjetdemokratie.
The first loss of innocence, the first political mortal sin, was doubtlessly the crushing of the Kronstadt rebellion, because then they went after their own people, after the young soldiers who'd supported the revolution, but now weren't convenient for whatever reason. If one was capable of that, then one was also capable of other things, as became evident later.
Trotsky watches the parade celebrating the victory of the Kronstadt sailors. Many were able to flee to Finland, but whoever fell into Bolsheviks' hands became victims of merciless revenge. In the first show trials of the young Soviet Republic, thousands are sentenced to death or long prison terms. Fast-track communism has failed. Failure to meet the population's basic needs, with famine spreading and an uprising in Kronstadt, clear signs of crisis. Lenin needs to change course. Just as his land redistribution in 1917 violates Marxist principles, Lenin is about to make an economic U-turn with noticeably capitalistic underpinnings.
He was the believer in the pure scientific Karl Marx theory that in reality was the utopia. But it was only until 1921. In 1921, Lenin reversed the Soviet policy. He returned to the allowing of the new economical policy, the private ownership, and he told it serious and for long. And he had very strong opposition among his followers, and Trotsky and Stalin and many others.
Das war die Legitimierung.
It basically legitimized the idea of a free market and private property, both of which were the bête noire of orthodox Marxists. For this reason, many Bolshevik functionaries and Bolshevik idealists felt that the new economic policy was a tremendous setback.
Die neue ökonomische Politik als einen ungeheuren Rückschlag empfunden.
Lenin attempts to save the country's economy at the 10th Party Conference. His new economic policies, NEP for short, are extremely controversial. Even his closest allies greet his policies with scathing ridicule. After heated debate, Lenin succeeds in pushing through a governmental resolution. Within the party, varying factions will no longer be tolerated. Opposition means exclusion. Dictatorship now begins within the Communist Party itself. The Russian economy recovers. Optimism is in the air. Fishermen and farmers sell goods at the marketplace. Money can now buy things and becomes an incentive to work.
Even at the height of the new economic policy, the standard of living in the Soviet Union and in Russia itself reached a historic high.
The stock market and the banks reopen. The new ruble is minted. Lenin goes so far as to invite Western capitalists to invest in Russia to help roll back the country's economic deficits. We must grant concessions to the foreign bourgeoisie and outside capital, were Lenin's words to the Third Communist International. But many comrades are convinced that Lenin's new economy will betray the basic principles of the revolution.
And what was Stalin's reaction to these proposals at the time? That they were the product of a sick mind. Gorbachev, who was a party functionary at the time, suggested that Lenin's decree, which had been published in Pravda, should be reissued in a special edition just for Lenin himself, since no one else needed to know about them.
In May 1922, Lenin's health deteriorates dramatically. He suffers his first stroke. 2 more would follow. Lenin withdraws from governmental activities. From this point on, he resides on a country estate near the city of Gorky. Leon Trotsky appears to be Lenin's uncontested successor, an intellectual with more charisma than any other Bolshevik leader and a popular commissioner who was victorious during the war. Lenin, however, was still alive and his successor had not yet been decided. And Trotsky had stiff competition. Joseph Stalin, the Communist Party's General Secretary.
Lenin was a genius of theory and practice, while Stalin was a genius of practice and theory. But Stalin was also a master criminal. He understood the role information plays. Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin can be mentioned in one breath. Their teachings were truly of epochal significance, but not because they were eternally valid or for every era, but only for that particular historical period.
Lenin was like a craftsman when ferreting out political enemies so that he might destroy them. But one could say Stalin turned that concept into an industry.
The difference between Lenin and his followers like Gaidar, then after 4 years Lenin understood it's enough, it's not working. And after that I don't think that he was a real Marxist. He became a statesman and the Russian political leader.
Along with the majority of thinking people in the Soviet Union, I believed that everything would be fine as long as Lenin was still alive. The great catastrophe supposedly didn't begin until after Lenin's death. My opinion of Lenin is more generous than most people's these days. The tendency is to try to take down Lenin along with Stalin. I consider that highly unfair from a historical perspective. Lenin acted in the heat of revolution and civil war. Under Lenin, The Communist Party played the dominant role over all other organizations. The Cheka. There were a number of dictatorial elements which were the foundation upon which Stalin could later build.
Ganz diktatorischen Elementen, auf die Stalin nachher aufbauen konnte.
Alle Elemente des Stalin.
It's important to realize that the germ of Stalinism is inherent in Leninism.
Das ist die wichtige Feststellung. Bei einer anderen
Under a different leader, the development of events may have taken a different course, but not one that would have led to democratic communism.
Hin zu einem, sagen wir mal, demokratischen Kommunismus.
That seems to me to be, as Leszek Kolakowski put it so well, like frying snowballs.
Gebratener Schneebäller.
Gewiss wollte Lenin.
Certainly, Lenin wouldn't have approved of events that were to come. And without a doubt, this was secretly discussed in Soviet times, if Lenin had been alive, he would have been convicted in one of the show trials that took place in the years between 1936 and 1938.
Lenin dies on January the 21st, 1924. The whole country is in mourning. Stalin arranges the burial. In a telegram to Trotsky, he gives a false date to keep the competition from attending the funeral. In his political testament, Lenin warned against the ambitious Stalin, but it was already too late. Within the span of 2 years as party general secretary, he replaced 16,000 functionaries. Another bloody chapter of Russian history begins.